There were no countries in Africa before colonization. There was states led by respected traditional leaders. Each state had its own language is equally respected. We were Christians but worshipping God in our own African way. We were not educated but we lived a natural quality life of our choice. Polygamy was our characteristics and identity as we biblically wanted to multiply. We had glorified and dignified traditional weddings that were merely divorced. Our skin color wasn't black but chocolate brown. We didn't use money but lived healthy and fairly on barter trade. We didn't have hospitals but we had our own traditional doctors. There was love, peace and harmony amongst us. There was no hunger, poverty, corruption, fraud, murder and hate. A neighbor was treated like a family, not a foreigner or an alien. Africa was partitioned by non-Africans in the absence of African leaders. We got colonized and our resources were looted to develop non-African countries. We were pushed to arid and infertile lands infected with tsetse flies and mosquitoes. Our skin color was tanned black and linked to evil. We were called barbaric blacks, baboons, monkeys and kafirs in our homeland. We were embarrassed, humiliated, tortured, harassed, beaten and killed to be depopulated. We were intimidated and forced to spy and expose one another. We were Africans in Africa without rights in their homeland. We were Africans restricted on where to go by non-Africans in Africa. We were slaves in our homeland. Our forefathers stood up and fought. We won and got back Africa to us. We called it independence, democracy and freedom. African independence didn't come alone. HIV mounted on us. Poverty heavily came on us. Unemployment fell on us. Chaos blossomed to us. Cancer carried away our lives. Sanctions were added to us. Now it's hunger, drought, earthquakes and cyclones. Where did we go wrong in Africa as Africans? African countries are all independent from their former colonial masters. Where are the fruits of independence, if I may ask? We now worship God in a non-African way. We are no longer polygamists, we are lesbians and gays. Sodom and Gomorrah was brought to us in Africa by non-Africans. African identity has been suppressed and diluted, polluted and converted. We Africans support non-African football clubs more than our own African teams. English, Portuguese, Spanish and French are our official languages at the expense of our own Bantu languages. We collectively fought together as Africans during our liberation struggle. We were not using visas, passports, emergency traveling documents, permits and asylums. What happened to our unity and togetherness? An African needs a passport and sometimes a visa to visit an African country. An African is annually given 90 days of staying in an African country. An African needs a certain amount of money to be granted permission to visit an African country. An African needs a study permit to study in Africa. An African needs a residential permit or an asylum to stay in Africa. An African needs a work permit to work in Africa. African speaks non-African languages more than their own African languages. Africans are called refugees in Africa while non-Africans are called tourists. Africans are called poachers in Africa while non-Africans are called professional hunters. Products manufactured from African products are unaffordable to Africans. Is this what we call independence in Africa? Why are Africans beggars while we have flora and fauna? Why do Africans need non-Africans to solve their own African problems? How many Africans have solved non-African problems? How many African leaders have sensitive posts like security in United Nations, and why? Is SADC and OAU helpful to Africans or is a toothless bulldog? Why do Africans hate one another? Why are Africans herbs rejected to cure Africans while non-Africans tablets cure Africans? Why are late African men called demons while their surnames are still in use? Our own traditional healers are now evil. Our own traditional leaders are politicians as puppets. Our traditional herbs are no longer important but useless. Who own businesses in Africa? Who owns land in Africa? Who are investors in Africa? Who is controlling African economy? Why are Africans still living in squatter camps in Africa? Why are Africans migrating to 9 African countries? Why are some African countries sanctioned? Who killed Gaddafi and why was he brutally killed? How far has Libyan economy improved after Gaddafi's brutal assassination? Where is African independence? Cry, my beloved Africa, until all Africans feel at home in Africa. Cry, my beloved Africa, until Africans completely gain total control of their natural resources. Cry, my beloved Africa, until child and human trafficking is over. Cry, my beloved Africa, until human abuse is ironed out. Cry, my beloved Africa, until Bantu languages are internationally recognized. Cry, my beloved Africa, until freedom of speech and freedom after speech prevails. Cry, my beloved Africa, until all African heroes and heroines are honored when still alive. Cry, my beloved Africa, until human rights are respected not violated. Cry, my beloved Africa, until better life for all arrives to all Africans. Cry, my beloved Africa, until all Africans have decent shelter. Cry, my beloved Africa, until education and health is for free. Cry, my beloved Africa, until all Africans afford decent meals. Cry, my beloved Africa, maybe our Lord will bless cursed Africa one day. I'm not an African politician, but an African patriotic poet. I'm a patriotic African ambassador through poetry. My message to Africans remains very clear and loud. My message to Africans remains poetic, not political. I'm not against non-Africans, but I advocate for African unity and peace. I won't keep quiet until all Africans wake up, smell coffee, and get united. I am Opet Dube.